Hi, everyone. Once again, my name is George Grant. I'm a technical specialist with Griffin. Today, we're going to be talking about the effective use of plant growth regulators. First, we're going to be talking about the factors that affect PGR performance, some non-chemical height control strategies, I should say, that you may not be aware of. And then if we get time to it, we'll go over some specific programs for some spring annual baskets and flats and pots. So here's a quick just table showing some very common PGRs. It doesn't show all of them that we use, but it gives you an idea of some of the major ones we'll be talking about today. On the left, we have, let me put it this way. There are many different active ingredients out there under different brand names. For simplicity reasons, I'm going to be using the names on the far left-hand column, but as you can see, there's different chemicals with also some different label language. Just as like any pesticide or fungicide, herbicide, etc., the label language is the law. So it's very important that you read the label to understand what it is approved for and how it needs to be used. For example, a major difference between B9 and Dazide is that Dazide has a 12-hour REI and B9 has a 24-hour REI. Another example would be Fresco and Fascination. Fascination, one, it has a relatively smaller concentration of active ingredient compared to Fresco. Fresco has about a little bit more an active ingredient, as well as it includes a drench label. That is also could be said for florell and cholate. Cholate has basically 10 times the amount of active ingredient compared to florell. Here's just a little overview of how you would mix up these chemicals, just to give you an idea of the concentrations we're going to be using with these different PGRs, as well as to understand that these chemicals are concentrated. Sometimes I get, you'd be surprised what I listen to from growers sometimes. I get a call once in a while from a grower showing me a photo of a plant that obviously has some phytotoxicity issue. Upon further investigation, we figure out that the rate they used was far too high. And I asked them, well, how did they mix it up? They go, well, I used 3 glugs from the bottle instead of 2. Right there, it gives you an idea that that is not how we should be mixing up these chemicals. It's very, very important that when you're mixing up these chemicals that you measure to as precise as possible. So I'm sure you're aware of the many benefits that we use for PGRs, but I'm going to touch on a few that you might not be as familiar with, such as decreasing irrigation frequency. If you've ever applied Bonsai, which is paclobutrazol, to a plant either via drench or spray, you might notice that the leaves get darker. Okay, that is because the chlorophyll is basically being concentrated, as well as the leaf itself is being smaller. What does this do? Okay, one, it increases the cuticle density around that leaf. A stronger cuticle will transpire less, thus it doesn't dry out as quickly. Some other things that PGRs can do is they can increase bud set. For example, Fuchsia, basically right after you get your last application of florell and Fuchsia, you can actually apply a Bonsai drench at 1 part per million, and that will actually increase the bud set, which is an interesting thing about this crop. We can also use PGRs to basically hasten or prolong bloom. That's where florell would come in. We can also use this in some ways. This is kind of controversial. We at Griffin like to promote a chemical for what it's labeled for. However, there are some indirect benefits that can be used for PGRs that have to do with thrips control and disease prevention. For example, when we use florell to basically delay flower development, there's less pollen for thrips to basically increase the populations quicker on. And also, when we use florell, what people will call a chemical pinch. So instead of having to mechanically pinch your crops, we can actually prevent TMV, tobacco mosaic virus, from being spread from crop to crop. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Here's another just quick overview of what these chemicals do as far as where they're being absorbed, if they're a retardant or if they're an accelerator of growth, what's the residual activity, their general spray volume, can they be drenched or not, and their general REI. As you can see, Bonsai, Zoomagic, and Top Floor vary from the rest of these chemicals because their majority of their absorption is done at the roots and the stems. Really, there's very little absorption that's taking place in the leaves. Cycocel, as far as compared to the other chemicals on this list, Cycocel is very proponent to having phytotoxicity. And this is typically not due to the concentration, but really the volume we're applying. So it's very important when you're applying Cycocel that we apply it to a glycine. We do not want to apply it to the point of drooping, whereas you would for most of these other products, or we could have phytotoxicity. And once again, a difference between Dazide and B9 is that B9's REI is 24 hours. You also notice Florell has a very, very long REI of 48 hours. So being in this position, I work with growers every day, and this allows us to, one, gain a lot of information that we can help propagate into this field, as well as we figure out what are gaps in the knowledge base of this field. So when people ask what's going on in PGR research, the things that we're finding out that are going to be most novel or going to be helping growers going forward is understanding how can we use PGRs early on in the production season to ultimately make a more quality plant and reduce the overall PGR applications that we're making. Also, liner dips are becoming more and more popular, so understanding how to effectively use them and the rates is very important. Each of these tools are specific and they have specific benefits, but now as we're getting more understanding of how to use them, we're understanding the synergism that we can use when we tank mix some of these products, which we'll go over a little bit later on. Also, the idea of advanced liners, which I'm not going to touch on this slide, but we will show some examples later on. Advanced liners, once again, how do I use PGRs to effectively shorten my crop time, but also guarantee a quality product? I'm going to talk about some of the factors that affect PGRs. Depending on where you are in the United States and that time of the year, it's going to drastically dictate the PGRs you're using, the concentrations you are using, and how often you're using them. For example, in the summertime, anywhere on the East Coast actually has the same amount of DLI, which is daily integral. Basically, the amount of light you get on a daily basis is relatively similar wherever you are in the summer on the East Coast. However, in the spring and fall periods, there's a drastic difference in the light intensity and temperatures depending on where you are in the north and south. So that'll dictate how much PGR you'll be using, basically. Ultimately, a plant grows stronger and faster when there's higher light and higher temperature. It's going to break up and utilize that PGR quicker if it's under those sort of conditions. So you can imagine wintertime or summertime in Florida versus summertime in Connecticut, those PGR applications may be a little bit different. Your temperature regime also goes back to the time of the year. Some of us have more control of our greenhouse conditions than others. So depending on how you can control those conditions, that will also influence the frequency of application of PGRs. We'll talk about morning dip. This is an interesting sort of cultural method that was found out several years ago, incidentally, but we'll go over it a little bit later in this presentation. The stage of crop development, which we'll see in the next slide, is incredibly important to how you apply PGRs. And also, as we mentioned, the way you spray and the type of products that we mix together can also give you different benefits. Here we have a mum crop that was applied with a 1 part per million bonsai drench. As you can see, the one on the right was applied a month later than the one on the left. Now, I'm sure you've received quite a bit of snow over the last several months, and hopefully you took some time to create a snowman. An easy way to create a snowman is actually get a snowball, take it to the top of a hill, and roll that snowball down the hill. And as it rolls, it picks up more snow. But you'll also notice that as it goes down the hill and gets bigger, it would be harder to stop that. Same thing happens here with plants. As they grow, they're gaining more momentum. They're gaining more biomass in the above portion and hopefully the root system as well. And so it's much harder to slow them down when it has all that biomass. You can think about when I apply bonsai, that bonsai is being taken up into the plant and then it's having to be allocated to all of the biomass and all of the branches and all the leaves of that plant. So you can tell that if something on the right, it's much larger when I apply that bonsai drench. All of that chemical is having to be allocated much further around that plant compared to something smaller. So the application timing of your PGRs can be very important and ultimately reduce the amount of PGRs you have to apply. Some other things to consider, I would say, is cultivar variation. This industry is an industry of fashion, right? So every year we have different genetics that do different things. We have basically, you take any species that we produce, and we have now genetics that make it any shape and size. So it's very important, based on the cultivar, you do your research, you work out whoever you're buying your plants from, to try to understand some cultural guides, some cultural recommendations on how to use PGRs effectively on those specific cultivars. Also, whenever we're using PGRs, we need to make sure that fertilizer, water, and spacing are in the ideal or adequate ranges, or our PGR effects may be increased or decreased indirectly. Also, it's important, I'm sure you're already aware of this, but University of Florida under Jim Barrett found out that pine bark, using pine bark in your media can basically tie up or decrease the efficacy of some PGRs, specifically paclobutrazol, the active ingredient in Bonsai. Here's a clear example of cultivar differences and how they affect our rates of PGRs. So here on the left we have Perfusion variety, and then on the left we have a Dreamland variety of Zinnia. As you can see, we had to use double the amount of Bonsai to basically end up with the same amount of height. Just gives you an idea. Some varieties are going to be much more vigorous than others, so that will ultimately require you to use much more PGR. Eric Runkelt at Michigan State University did some experiments with how to understand how do we increase the efficacy of PGRs based on the environment. Now, when we think about a plant in ideal conditions, what is that? High light, low relative humidity, high air movement. What do those things mean? High temperature, what do those things give us? That gives us basically plants drying out quickly. Thus, they're taking up fertilizer, they're growing quickly. Now, when we're applying PGRs, we want the exact opposite. Why is that? Because we don't want PGRs to dry quickly. PGRs, as applied in the foliage, we want them to slowly dry. The slower they dry, the more absorption that's occurring on the foliage. So think about that. When we apply PGRs, we really want relatively low light conditions, we want lower temperatures, low air movement, and thus high relative humidity. Research from the University of Maryland, from John Irwin, who was previously at the University of Minnesota for many years, did some information and kind of carried on with this research by showing that a foliar application of various PGRs, he let dry, and then he re-wet them through a mist just to see how that affected the reabsorption. So what he showed is that B9, Bonsai, and Zoomagic, when they were re-wet, they actually had a greater effect on the growth regulation. What does that mean? That means that the initial application of these PGRs, they dried, and some of it was absorbed, but not all of it. So that residue dried on that foliage, and then when we re-wet the foliage, that residue went back into solution and thus could have been reabsorbed in the leaves. Now, he did notice that ARES and Cycocel were not affected with this sort of application. Really, this research shows us that we need to understand a little bit more about the drying conditions for PGRs and their efficacy. Tank mixing, very important. Not really quite used that much. However, people are now becoming more and more confident and comfortable with PGRs, and they're starting to play around with these sort of tank mixes. B9 and Cycocel has been around for a very long time. There is a kind of a synergism here where they're both growth retardants. However, what also happens is B9 happens to reduce the yellowing or phytotoxicity that Cycocel can have by itself. Now, caution, whenever you're trying something new like this, you always want to trial, and we'll talk about this a little bit further, but trialing is relatively inexpensive. Trialing something can help you prevent a massive problem without jumping headfirst in. This is another different type of tank mix where we have B9, a growth retardant, and florell, which is basically it's somewhat of a growth retardant, but really what it does is it prevents early blooms. So as you can see, we have a photo here donated by Royal Hines. We appreciate that. Of some petunias, where on the left we have no PGR applications, and on the right we have basically a relatively well-branched, compact, and a non-flowered plant for transplanting. Here's another photo from Royal Hines showing basically an older variety of lantana. It looks like a little bit more vigorous. On the left we have no PGR, which, as you can see, is very elongated, has quite a bit of stretch between internodes, and is flowering, which is not ideal for this grower at this time. However, on the right, this same tank mix of B9 florell created a more preferable plant for the cellar. So florell, Ephifon. Ephifon, basically, once it's absorbed through the foliage, it's metabolized in the plant to create ethylene. Okay, ethylene does a few different things for the plant. Now, out of all the PGRs that we run into, I would say florell is probably the one that we get back from growers saying, I had mumps and I applied my florell at the appropriate time. I'm still getting crown budding. What's going on? That same sort of scenario happens with many different crops that we typically use florell on. Why is that? Florell is a really tricky one. When we're looking at all the environmental conditions or or things that have to do with PGR effectiveness, we need to make sure that we're checking all the boxes when we apply florell. That includes uniform spray coverage. Florell does not translocate very well through the plant, so it's very important that the sprayer does a very relatively uniform application of that florell, typically on both sides of the bench. Many times I've seen a sprayer just try to go down the bench and spray one side of the bench, hoping that it gets both sides of the plant, that you end up with a lopsided plant or plants that with flower on one side and not on the other. Slowing drying conditions, as we'll see in a little bit later, is very important for florell as well. Once again, ethylene. The plant creates ethylene when it's under stress, and ethylene itself also creates stress on the plant. So it's very important when you're using florell to not apply it to plants that are under stress. That could be either drought stress, that could be right before shipping, right at transplant, or any other type of stress such as nutrition or not being well rooted. Florell in itself is very acidic. The pH of a solution that when we apply, and I'm sure you've heard of this concept, our spray pH, regardless if it's an insecticide, a fungicide, a PGR, is very important to basically the solubility and the activity of that chemical. Florell is a little bit more difficult compared to other PGRs because it requires a solution pH, a spray solution pH of 5.0 or lower, which is fairly acidic. Florell in itself is acidic. So if you have water that has very little alkalinity, which is basically your buffering capacity in your water, then it's basically pure. You can use florell, and when you apply it to your solution, it should drop the spray solution down to 5.0. However, if you do not have quite a bit of alkalinity in your water, you can find that this changes the scenario. So this was a study done by Roberto Lopez, where he basically mixed up 3 solutions, where he had a 50 part per million alkalinity, 150 parts per million alkalinity, and 300 parts per million alkalinity. Now, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to get a water test. Get one every annual, just to understand just alone the alkalinity of your water. That can dictate quite a bit, just both in your solution spray pH activity as well as your fertilizer plans. Now, 300 parts per million alkalinity is very high. 150, anything above that we'd consider high as well, but anywhere between 52 or a little under 120 is ideal generally for growing plants. Now, what he did is he mixed up different parts per million of florell, essentially, and then saw how that dictated and how it changed the solution pH. As we said, florell wants a solution pH of 5.0 or below, but as you can see, the more florell that we mixed up, the higher concentration, it dropped the solution pH. But as you can see, as the higher alkalinity that we start with, it doesn't have much of a dramatic decrease in the solution pH. So it's very important to understand that when we're mixing up florell and other PGRs for that matter, we understand what pH of that solution is before we apply it. And if you need to lower pH, there's several products out there, but typically the easiest way to do it is with sulfuric acid. This is another study done by Roberto Lopez where he's evaluating temperature conditions at the time of florell spray. Now, a good way to understand how well florell works is looking at the days to flower. As we discussed, florell will basically cause a bloom delay in many crop species. Here we had two species of plants that are commonly used with florell. We have petunias and ivy geraniums. As you can see, the temperature is increasing from 57 all the way to 79 degrees Fahrenheit. And right at that 73 degrees Fahrenheit cutoff, that's when we can see that the effects of florell really stop losing its effect. So that's really important. As you can see, at above 73 degrees Fahrenheit, we have plants that are obviously bigger and they're blooming, which is not ideal. Now we're going to talk about some side effects that are sometimes intentional or non-intentional when we're using PGRs. We've always heard about it's common for people to associate PGRs with delaying of blooms. Now, florell, we understand that. That's part of why we use florell is for delaying of blooms. Florell, on average, can delay blooms of some crops up to 6 weeks. For New Guinean patients, they'll do it much longer than that. So I don't even recommend florell in New Guinean patients unless it's at very, very small concentrations, maybe on stock plants for propagation reasons. Now, as far as the other PGRs go, Aris and Cycocel have very little to no bloom delay, whereas B9 has been noted to have significant bloom delay, especially when we go over 1 or 2 applications, depending on the variety. Bonsai, Paxol, Zoomagic, Top Floor, These do not have, they have very minimal to moderate bloom delay. And whenever we have the chance to use drenches, it would be in favor to use a drench because there will definitely be minimal to no bloom delay. As we mentioned before, cycocel is very common to cause phytotoxicity if the volume applied is over what's recommended. If we're applying where we have such a high volume that's puddling up, which is very common in geraniums because they have these pools within the leaves, as you can see a little bit on the right-hand side of this photo. If they pool up, it's likely that you're going to have this phytotoxicity. Here we have a grower that you can probably already tell what happened. They transplanted and they waited a little bit too long on this Rudbeckia to space it out. What does that do? Space itself is a great PGR. When we don't have space, we can make plants grow really, really fast. And that's kind of what's happened here. Not indirectly, but actually this is what's happened. So they waited a little too long, the plants started stretching, and then they tried to curb that stretch by adding a B9 at a little bit too high of rate, and it's caused this issue. This kind of goes back to the idea of advanced liners, okay? Some research has been done at the University of Florida by Paul Fisher. I recommend you look into it. Ultimately, the idea of advanced liners is the more time we keep a plant in a smaller container compared to it being on the bench in a larger hanging basket, we're actually saving money, okay? And the reason why this is one, for space allocations, but also we can produce a well-rooted, a dense, compact plant and something like this in a larger tray size, use multiple PGR applications, and then the moment we get that into a hanging basket or its final container size, it's going to explode. And once we have a really good root system and basically carbohydrate storage in this plant and it gets potted up, it's going to explode, and it's also going to finish quicker. And that's what some of the research Paul has shown. Here's a grower scenario where we had a grower who was scared to death of bonsai, and for good reason. Bonsai is a very concentrated product, and over applying it, if you over apply it from 1 part per million to 10 parts per million, you'll quickly see that you're going to have some issues. So we explained the benefits of using bonsai to this grower, and in order for them to really get on board with using it, we had them perform a small scale trial. And as you can see here on the left, we had a plant with no bonsai, obviously a little bit more, not as compact, a little more stretched. And also you can see that the bonsai drench on the right for this plant actually made it produce blooms a little bit quicker. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Configure. This is benzyladenine, also abbreviated as BA. It's a synthetic cytokinin. Cytokinins have multiple benefits for plants. However, majority of it's used for branching, and also producing more offsets. This could be, and what I like about Configure in the label is that it actually gives some specific directions on the label on how to use it for some specific situations, such as Christmas cactus and hosta. In a way, this does something what florell does do as well. Florell has, one, it increases branching because we believe it is a chemical pinch, but florell is actually not a chemical pinch. What it does is it breaks apical dominance. Apical dominance is the main shoot, the main trunk of that plant wants to grow first, wants to grow the tallest. However, what florell and Configure both do is they break that dominance. They allow for branching to occur and basically make it uniform branching rather than the apical shoot of that plant growing the most. Configure is important when we're applying. Slow drying has been shown to be very important. 4 hours is not required, but it's strongly recommended when you're applying it to get maximum benefits. This is difficult because when do you have 4 hours of drying time? This typically has to be done really early in the morning or into the evening hours. Obviously, that's something to consider because when we're applying something at night, we're going into the nighttime hours with our plants being wet, and obviously there can be some disease instances with that sort of condition. So we've gone over different chemicals, but we still have to decide, even if we have the tools that we need, how do we apply them? So when you're debating on spraying versus drenching, how do you choose them? In general, spraying can be much faster. I can spray quite a bit. I can go down a row, spray quite a bit of plants very quickly compared to using a drench, depending on how it's applied. Typically, drenches can be applied through a drench machine where we have a uniform volume going down the line and drenching individual plants. That can be very labor intensive and very time consuming. However, sprays have been shown to be more proponent to delaying bloom and bloom size compared to drenches. Also, drenches in general, have a much longer residual compared to sprays. So if I could use one drench versus 3 sprays, it may make more economic sense to do a spray compared to multiple, or a drench compared to multiple sprays. Also, once again, it's very important if you are using some large percentage of pine bark in your mixes, you may need to adjust your PGR drench rates accordingly. Now, spraying gets away from that element altogether. Bonsai or Zoomagic, they're both very strong chemicals. They're both strong retardants. Now, a little bit of history, you could use this at trivia dinner, is they're both a part of the triazole group. The triazole fungicide group, which is the mode of action 3, these chemicals were originally found out because they were evaluating them as fungicides, but then found out that they had quite a bit of plant growth regulation as well. You can see this propiconazole, which is another triazole. It's a fungicide used in Banner Max and Concert 2. That's an example. So it's kind of interesting how this was discovered. Now, if we do a little bit of cost analysis of Zoomagic versus Bonsai, Zoomagic is stronger than Bonsai. We're typically using half to a third of the rate compared to Bonsai, and depending on the variety and obviously species. But if we look at the cost, Zoomagic is 5 times the amount for the same parts per million. So that's just something to consider. Now, that being said, Zoomagic does work better on certain crops compared to Bonsai. Something that Zoomagic has that Bonsai does not, and also really any other PGR that we've been talking about, is its edible crop label. Zoomagic is labeled for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants at the young plant stage, essentially. Now, and that's dictated on the supplemental label for Zoomagic. It's very important that, once again, Zoomagic is very strong, so it's very important that you trial small rates and understand the varieties of these crops that you're working with. There's many times I've seen an over-regulated tomato with Zoomagic, and that homeowner is not happy. It never grows because it just stays so compact and tight. So Fascination, now we're looking, so Bonsai and Zoomagic, the way they work is they don't allow the plant to create GA, or gibberellic acid. GA forces a plant to increase its internode elongation, thus it becomes a stretchier plant. Okay, that's how that works. But Fascination, it just adds gibberellic acid. So it doesn't even need the plant to create the GA, it just adds it to the plant. Okay, so that's the way that works. So we're using Zoomagic and Bonsai to retard growth or not allow GA to be produced. Fascination bypasses all that, and it just adds GA straight to the plant. So we're using this primarily to increase leaf, stem, and overall plant size. Now, I'll mention with Fascination, because we're adding straight GA to the plant, we can't get rid of that GA once we've applied it. So be very careful when you use Fascination. If I apply Fascination, it's going to do its thing. Okay, well, I can try, if I over apply Fascination and it's really stretching on me, then I immediately need to understand what happened, and I need to try to go in with something like a Bonsai or Zoomagic to not let that plant stretch anymore. But that's what the Bonsai and Zoomagic are doing. They're not allowing the plant to create more GA, but because of Fascination straight GA, it's going to do the work that we put on. Fascination is used it's typically, if it's used correctly, it should be used for rescuing a plant. When I've over applied Bonsai or Zoomagic, and probably the most common application is on Begonias. If you're even holding a bottle of Bonsai and you look at Begonias, they'll be stunted. Typically, if they're over applied, then you can use Fascination to basically add GA to the plant and get that plant stretching again. There's the rates of Fascination can range depending on your applications. However, a general rule of thumb is to start with 3 parts per million and then reevaluate how much that stretches the plant about 3 to 5 days after that application. Mums, for example, are a little bit more vigorous. They're not as responsive to Fascination, so they might require something a little bit heavier. Here's a clear example of a plant on the left that was over PGR'd with Bonsai. That may have either been an accidental drench or more commonly a little bit of a spray drift that got on the plant. And as you can see, with a 3 part per million Fascination spray, we were able to unlock that plant and get it moving again. Now, Fresco, another chemical that basically a substitute of Fascination, is labeled as a drench. There's been research done by Brian Whipker recently, and I believe Joyce Latimer as well on the perennial side, showing how can we use Fresco as a drench to effectively unlock plants that have been over PGR'd. As you can see, we have some Gara plants that were applied twice with 20 parts per million of Piccolo, which is the substitute for Bonsai. They were over applied PGRs, they were locked up, and then they were given a Fresco application to overcome that. And as you can see, we can see that after 5 parts per million, we were able to unlock the plant accordingly. So let's talk about controlling plants without PGRs. Morning dip, which is ultimately as the sun is rising, 3 hours before really the first light is present, I'm going to lower my greenhouse temperature by about 5 degrees. What is happening there? What's the science behind this? As the sun is coming up, there's a lot of far red light, okay? Far red light causes a plant to want to stretch. And so during that time period, we can counteract that ability for that plant to want to stretch by lowering that temperature, okay? And so we're lowering that temperature, we're counteracting that plant to want to stretch. And then also what this does, it lowers our overall average daily temperature, which can have which is very good for maintaining crop compactness overall. Crop scheduling is very important, especially for plants that require a certain photoperiod. For example, poinsettias. I know this isn't a spring crop, but this is a good example. If I have a very vigorous poinsettia crop, which is an obligate short day plant, it will not flower unless I'm under short days, I can plant it later so it has less weeks of vegetative growth compared to till the time it gets to flowering. So crop scheduling can be very important depending on the crop you're using. Now, detailed record keeping is also very important when it comes to PGRs. There's all these different PGRs out there. There's all these different crops we're growing. It's very important for you to keep strict records of what to do when. Also, it's very important, I think something we don't talk about enough is that you can use these environmental conditions and other cultural aspects to hold crops longer than what a PGR could do. Is fertilizer stretching my plants? This question is asked quite a bit, and the previous knowledge base used to think that it was the type of nitrogen, either ammonium or nitrate, that was stretching my plants. But really what we've seen in the latest research is actually our phosphorus. Our phosphorus is our main enemy for causing stretch in our plants. This is some research done by Brian Whipker, where he evaluated how much phosphorus are we actually providing our plants. He mixed up a 200 parts per million nitrogen solution of 20-20, which hopefully no one's really using anymore, 20-10-20 and 15-5-15. And as you can see, we have quite a bit of phosphorus in these fertilizers at 200 parts per million nitrogen. But we know through research now that even our most heavy feeders, mums, petunias, poinsettias, they only need a maximum of 20 parts per million of phosphorus. So what is that doing? The excess phosphorus we're giving them is actually causing excessive elongation, and also it inhibits growth by making some nutrients, some micronutrients specifically, incompatible with being taken up by the plant. I don't know originally how it came up, why phosphorus was so good, why it creates more flower power, but it's not the truth, okay? We are applying way too much phosphorus to our plants in general, okay? Phosphorus is expensive. It's probably the most expensive component other than chelates in your general fertilizer. So once again, we need to reevaluate how much phosphorus we're applying. And once again, it'll antagonize micronutrients or secondary macronutrients like iron, manganese, and zinc. Low light is, in general, an enemy, okay? The more light we get on a plant, the more compact it's going to be. And that's been shown by several researchers. Also, the light quality, going back to early hours of sunlight. The early hours of sunlight, as that sun's coming up, the light quality of the sun is actually favored to be more far red, compared to if you see the sun in the middle of the day, if you're not looking directly at it. But that's when, at the middle of the day, when the sun is most bright, that's where more blue and red light compared to far red light is present. And so that's why plants are more compact during the day, or less likely to stretch during the middle of the day compared to the morning. Now I want to quickly go over this. Obligate short day plants, facultative short day plants. Easiest example is poinsettias. Okay, they will not flower, no matter what you do, they will not flower until the days have gotten shorter, the day length has gotten shorter. Now there's some plants that don't require this requirement, this photoperiodic requirement. However, under short days, they'll bloom faster, okay, such as African marigolds, sunflowers, and zinnias. Now, on the other side of it, we have some plants that need a long day in order to flower, such as wave petunias. Some plants will actually bloom faster under long days as well, but it's not an absolute requirement, such as calibrachoa and petunias. Now we're going to quickly go over, I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm going to try to go into some PGR strategies for some spring basket combinations. These two resources, if you don't have them printed out or bookmarked on your computer already, I highly recommend you do it. They're free. You can go online and get them. But basically, Grower Talks in relationship with Fine Americas, Brian Whipker and Joyce Vladimir, Vladimir have produced these at least every other year, and now they're starting to do it every year. These are great references that'll go through PGR recommendations for a wide range of crop species. Okay, so when we're growing mixed planters, it's important to understand we might be growing different species that have different PGR requirements. So what you can do, for example, let's say I've got a calibrachoa and petunia, and that's going to be the most aggressive thing in that combination planter. What I can do is I can apply a PGR before I transplant to retard that growth, to control that growth, and then once transplanted, then I can apply a PGR that'll be effective on all the crops in that planter. Liner/rooting cutting dips. This is something that's relatively new. I don't believe it's. There are some things to consider with this when you're going to use this sort of application. The benefits to it is that you can drench quite a lot of plants in trays really quickly and relatively uniformly for low cost. However, wherever we're putting a massive amount of plants in the same solution, there's always a chance of spreading disease. So I always want you to keep that in mind when you're doing an application such like this. The Piccolo label is labeled for liner dips, and there are several other PGRs that are labeled for this manner as well. I like the Piccolo label because it gives you some specific directions on how to use a liner dip, such as we're going to soak from anywhere from 1/2 to 2 minutes. It's very important that when we're applying it, the plants are not drought stressed, but they're also not soaking wet. We want to make sure that we're sub-irrigating that PGR into the soil upwards. So calibrachoas and petunias, probably one of the most common mixed planter or single species planter used in the United States. Very vigorous, relatively act the same way, so we can use similar PGR strategies. Recently, we've tried to promote a non-pinch sort of a PGR strategy. Okay, and the way we're using a combination of PGRs to ultimately save labor and reduce the transmission of diseases. Once again, if you have one plant that has TMV, tobacco mosaic virus, and you're mechanically shearing across an entire bench, that plant that had the TMV, it's possible for that sap to be transmitted, and thus that virus to be transmitted to all the plants on that bench. So using PGRs to get away from mechanical pinching has some benefits. Okay, what we do typically is calibrachoa and petunias. The number one thing is we want to make sure we ensure adequate branching, and that's through florell applications. Okay, we typically start with a 500 part per million spray, and several of these can be done, but keep in mind we don't want to delay flowers so much that we're ultimately not going to be able to sell them. So have an idea of when you want to stop your florell applications, as well as from there we're going to retard growth primarily through Bonsai and Zoomagic drenches. What we'd like to do is once the plant has been transplanted and it's grown to the outer rim of the container, that's when we're going to start getting our drenches on. And obviously the rate depends depending on the variety, but typically we're working with 1 to 2 parts per million of calibrachoas, Bonsai, and then for wave and vegetative petunias, we're working at a higher rate of 3 to 5 parts per million. This is a clear photo of what tobacco mosaic virus looks like. Scouting is obviously important. We could give a whole presentation on how to scout and the importance of it, but this is a very serious disease, so always be on the lookout for it. And if you ever think you have something like this, it needs to be reported to a technical rep. Okay, we have a little bit of time, and I want to go through. We may not get through all of these, but these are some specific recommendations for various different species that we typically would grow. Okay, I'll go through. I won't touch on all of them, but I'll go through some of the major ones. Begonias, out of all the species that we grow, dragonwing begonias are much more vigorous, so that's when we'll actually use bonsai, but still we'll use very low rates. The D bolded means drench, and the FS means a foliar spray. So if you're looking at it at this handout later on, you'll understand what's going on. Going back to fuchsia, what we found anecdotally is that after your last florell application, you can get a bonsai drench on at 1 parts per million, and that will drastically increase the bud count and thus the floral display. It's quite amazing, actually, what this one slight thing does to enhance this species going forward. Ivy geraniums versus calliope geraniums. Ivy geraniums are slightly more vigorous, thus our PGR concentrations are going to be a little bit heavier. Okay, florell is a little bit so this will range from 350 to 500 parts per million of florell. From there, we'll go on from the bonsai application. And as you can see with calliope geraniums, drenching geraniums in general is a little bit risky because they're very, very sensitive. So always keep in mind that we're not going to really typically go above 1 part per million. There's many different types of impatiens out there, but what I want to focus on impatiens. Impatiens have been gaining momentum recently, and I want you to keep in mind that they're much different than New Guineas. Okay, they're really, really sensitive to PGR applications, and this is some information supplied by Sakata, and we do appreciate the slides. But what I want to show is that probably the #1 problem is that they're over PGR'd from the grower side, and then when they're planted in the landscape, they end up looking what this looks like on the right. So we're hoping that they're going to flush out in the landscape, but they don't. We over-applied so much bonsai, so much Zoomagic, that they're locked up for months, for weeks. And so they never actually start growing. So when it comes to impatiens, you're not going to grow them like New Guineas. You're going to grow them like their own different species. Okay, the things that we found to get away from PGRs with some patients include high light, adequate space, and actual drought stressing. Drought stressing is a great way to control plants. But it's risky, obviously. But when I drought stress a plant, when it's drought stressed, it's not growing. It's basically shut down. Okay. But obviously, the more we drought stress a plant, we can take it too far and we can damage roots, we can burn foliage, etc. If you have to use PGRs on some patients, I recommend sprays only of A-Rest, Cyclosillar B9 at the typical rates that you would apply these chemicals. As you can see, there's a good photo at the bottom here that shows what a typical species looks like when you over-applied a PGR. You get these gnarled, very thick, smaller foliage. Also, it's typically a little bit darker green as well. So as you can see, once again, highlight, cool temperatures, less watering. That's the cultural methods, the non-PGR methods that we're going to use to adequately produce a compact and nice looking sun patient. Hypomia, it's always going to be vigorous. It's a difficult plant to grow unless you're just shearing it or florelling it. That being said, it's a beautiful plant. Once it's in the landscape, you probably are not going to get it out. Just keep that in mind. It will take over any place that you plant it. Lantana, it's gone a long way genetically. The older varieties that are still quite a bit used in landscapes, you have to bonsai the heck out of them. Very woody, very vigorous. However, newer varieties are so compact. I mean, they're literally meatballs. They're so compact that you really don't even need to PGR them, which I think is very good. Portulaca, if you're not spraying it with an herbicide outside and you're growing it in your greenhouse, those also have gone quite a bit genetically. They used to be quite vigorous. However, now the more trailing types of a little bit more, they still require quite a bit of more PGR. However, depending on the genetics, they vary quite a bit on what you need. I will say on this Terrinia, we do not florell it, and there is a kind of a list out there of plants that we do not florell. And the reason why that is either it causes phytotoxicity or it delays the bloom so much. I'll give you an example. Bougainvillea, mandevilla, if you apply florell to these, they have a tendency to completely defoliate. So some plants are very, very sensitive to ethylene, essentially. So keep that in mind. Do your research before you just think about florelling something that's new to you or doing a small scale trial. Verbena is very pretty straightforward. I would say they're fairly reactive to PGRs, and most growers just use a typical florell application, 1 or 2 B9 applications, and then they'll finish off with a bonsai drench. Rosa, how are we doing? Are we doing okay on time, Rosa?
You have like a few minutes. So it's still 50 now. So we would like to have some time for questions.
Okay, we'll go through a couple of these, and then we'll, like I said, the handout that will be provided to you will have all this information. So when it comes to spring pansies, we don't want to overplot. We don't want to over regulate them. Similar to how you would do with a sun patient, we do not want the grower or the person, the home grower, to plant this and then it just not move on them. So they're very responsive to bonsai drenches. If you have to drench them right before, I typically recommend it early on, actually, so they have some time to grow out of it, but you typically use a very low rate at 1/8 of a part per million. Okay. So here's an idea of Alyssum, great product. Alyssum is actually, if this is just something aside, but if you use control agents like predatory mites, predatory wasps, etc., Alyssum is a great thing to plant between your greenhouses. They actually will attract natural predators that will feed on thrips and aphids. So I do recommend using them. Alyssum is a pretty straightforward plant to grow. They do great. It responds very well in bonsai. Okay. Once again, begonias, we're not going to touch them with bonsai. Coleus can be vigorous depending on the variety. I will say that the lighter colored, the yellow and kind of green colored, can be a little bit less. They're not as photosynthetically efficient as the red and darker varieties, surprisingly. So they actually require less PGR compared to the darker varieties. What I like about Dusty Millet is that when enough research has been done, either through grower trials or academic research, is that we can have a recipe. So here at Dusty Millet, great example. We're at the 6 true leaf stage, then we know what PGRs typically apply. Now this doesn't go for all varieties, but in general, with enough experience, we can make this recommendation relatively confidently. Another example of this would be Easter lilies. So Easter lilies have been around forever, and actually we can use florell, we can use Fascination prior to them going into the freezer to prevent leaf yellowing. So that's just kind of interesting how each of these plants have these different things or quirks when they work with PGRs. Gerber daisies, important to control them early on. I will say if you can control the stock of the plant with a bonsai spray or drench or later on. So depending on what your customer likes, if they like the flower directly over the foliage or they like a long stalk, you can, depending on your application, you can adjust that. Oh gosh, millet. It's a difficult one. Very vigorous. I would say it's probably one of the most vigorous plants we typically use. This is an example of when we're using a mixed planter. Let's say I've got a calibrachoa and I've got a millet in the middle, which is I've seen quite a bit. I've seen with mums as well. It's challenging because it's so vigorous. I mean, we're using 5 to 8 parts per million as a bonsai drench. You're not typically using that high a rate for really anything. So that's a tricky one. That's something you may want to regulate first before transplanting it with a multi-planter.